There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary, like a Tuesday evening or a simple question asked in a quiet room. They don't announce themselves with thunder or fanfare. They slip in through the cracks of your routine, and only later, when you trace the map of your own heart, do you realize that this was the place where the landscape shifted forever. It was the point where one coastline ended and a new, uncharted one began. For me, that moment was a question whispered into the space between us on a night that felt exactly like 100 others, and yet was nothing like them at all. It was the moment a door I had long believed to be sealed shut, not just locked but bricked over, suddenly revealed a hinge. Can I stay here tonight? The question hung in the air of my small living room, as fragile as a soap bubble. Julian was standing by the door, his hand on the knob but not turning it. His bag was slung over his shoulder, a testament to the life he lived out of suitcases and hotel rooms, a life of perpetual motion. But tonight, the motion had stopped. He looked rooted to the floor, his shoulders slumped with a weariness that went far beyond his latest cross-country flight. The streetlights outside cast long, distorted shadows through the window, striping the floor between us like a cage. He wasn't looking at me, but at a point on the wall just past my shoulder, as if the question was too heavy to be delivered face to face. I had built my entire friendship with him on a foundation of carefully maintained distance, a buffer zone of plausible deniability. It was a structure designed to protect me, to keep the delicate, secret architecture of my feelings for him from collapsing. His question was a tremor, a single, potent vibration that threatened the whole damn thing. I could have said no. I could have invented an excuse, pointed to the early hour I needed to be awake, or simply reminded him that his own apartment was a mere 15-minute drive away. Any of those answers would have been logical. They would have been safe. They would have reinforced the boundaries I had spent years meticulously drawing. But the truth was, looking at him standing there, looking so utterly lost and adrift, the architecture of my self-preservation felt less like a fortress and more like a ruin. The silence stretched, and in it, I felt the tectonic plates of my life begin to grind against each other. The choice was simple. I could reinforce the wall, or I could open the gate. Yeah, I said, my voice rougher than I intended. Of course. The relief that washed over his face was so profound it was almost painful to watch. It was like seeing a drowning man finally break the surface of the water, gasping for air. He didn't say thank you. Not then. He just nodded, a small, jerky movement, and let his hand fall from the doorknob. The quiet click of the deadbolt I turned a moment later felt impossibly loud, a final, definitive sound that echoed in the sudden stillness of the room. A lock turning, a boundary shifting. He was in, and I had a feeling, deep in the marrow of my bones, that I had just let in something I would never be able to let go of again. To understand the weight of that night, you have to understand the years that came before it. You have to understand the geography of our friendship. I met Julian during my junior year of college, in a ridiculously overcrowded intro to economics class that neither of us wanted to be in. I was there to fulfill a general education requirement, a photographer hiding amongst business majors, feeling like a spy in a foreign land. He was there because he'd overslept during registration, and it was one of the only classes left that fit his schedule. He sat down next to me on the second day, all bright energy and an easy smile, and asked to borrow a pen. It was such a simple, forgettable moment, the kind that happens 1,000 times in a person's life. But for me, it was the beginning. He had a light about him, an effortless charisma that drew people in like moths. He wasn't loud or arrogant. It was quieter than that. It was a genuine warmth, a way of looking at you when you spoke that made you feel like you were the only person in the room. In the sterile, tiered lecture hall, he was a pocket of sunshine. I was, by contrast, a creature of shadow and observation. I lived behind the lens of my camera, more comfortable capturing moments than participating in them. I saw the world in frames, in compositions of light and dark, in the subtle story told by a person's posture or the way their eyes caught the light. I was quiet, I was patient, and I was, even then, deeply and irrevocably lonely. Our friendship grew in the unlikely soil of that economics class. He'd lean over and whisper some dry, ridiculous comment about macroeconomic theory, and I'd fight back a smile. We started studying together, mostly because he was struggling and I had a knack for memorizing the dry formulas. Our study sessions quickly devolved into long conversations about everything and nothing, about his dreams of traveling the world, about my passion for capturing the unseen beauty in forgotten places. He was fascinated by my photography. He didn't just say the pictures were nice, he asked questions. He wanted to know why I chose a certain angle, what I was trying to say with the deep shadows in one photo or the blown-out highlights in another. He saw the intention behind my art, and in doing so, he saw me in a way that few people ever had. It was during one of those late-night sessions in the campus library, surrounded by the dusty smell of old books, that I knew I was in trouble. He was explaining some complicated family drama, gesticulating with his hands, his brow furrowed in concentration. The fluorescent lights overhead were humming, casting a flat, unflattering glare on everything. But on him, it seemed to catch in his hair, turning it to spun gold. He laughed at something, a deep, genuine sound that echoed slightly in the cavernous room, and he threw his head back. In that instant, a single, terrifyingly clear thought shot through my mind. I love you. It wasn't a conscious decision. It was a fact, presenting itself with the undeniable force of gravity. It was a lens clicking into focus, revealing a truth that had been there all along, just slightly blurred at the edges. And with that realization came the fear. A deep, cold, paralyzing fear. Because Julian was Julian. He was sunshine and easy smiles and a string of girlfriends who were all as bright and lovely as he was. He moved through the world with an assumption of its welcome, an assumption I could never share. My feelings for him felt like a contraband object, something precious but illicit that I had to keep hidden at all costs. To reveal it would be to risk everything. The easy camaraderie, the late-night talks, the simple, uncomplicated joy of his presence in my life. I would rather have him as a friend than not have him at all. So I made a choice. I packed my feelings away. I built a room for them deep inside myself, soundproofed and locked, and I threw away the key. My friendship with Julian became my most carefully curated project. I became an expert in the art of loving from a distance, of translating the roaring inferno in my chest into the quiet, steady warmth of platonic affection. After college, our lives diverged in practice, but not in spirit. He took a consulting job that sent him flying across the country 3 weeks out of every month. I stayed in the city, building a fragile career as a freelance photographer, shooting weddings and portraits to pay the bills while pouring my soul into my personal projects, moody, atmospheric shots of urban decay and overlooked landscapes. My apartment, a small one-bedroom with good natural light, became my sanctuary and my studio. It was the one place that was entirely mine, and, over time, it became his anchor. Whenever he was back in town, he'd text me, "Home. Need a dose of normalcy. Your couch free." And my couch was always free. He would show up at my door, exhausted from travel, shed his corporate skin along with his suit jacket, and collapse into the worn cushions of my sofa. He'd talk about his projects, about the frustrating clients and the sterile hotel rooms, about the loneliness of airport terminals. I would listen, make him coffee, and for a few hours, we would fall back into the easy rhythm of our college days. He'd tell me about the women he was dating, brief, flickering relationships that never seemed to survive the logistics of his lifestyle. I would listen, my heart a dull, familiar ache in my chest, and offer the carefully neutral advice of a good friend. Each mention of a girlfriend was another brick in the wall of the secret room inside me, reinforcing its necessity. He never came to my place with his girlfriends. It was our space. He called it his debriefing zone for me. It was both a haven and a form of exquisite torture. Having him so close, so relaxed and unguarded, was everything I wanted. But the invisible line between us was a constant, humming presence in the room. I was hyper-aware of every casual brush of his arm against mine, the way his leg would sometimes rest against my own as we sat on the small sofa. I would catalog these moments, analyzed them in the dead of night, and always dismissed them as meaningless. They were artifacts of friendship, nothing more. To believe otherwise was a path to ruin. And so, for years, I lived this double life, the calm, supportive friend on the outside, and the man silently screaming his love into a soundproofed room on the inside. It was a lonely, exhausting existence, but it was stable, until the day Sarah broke up with him. The phone call came on a Tuesday afternoon. I was in my darkroom, the acrid smell of chemicals clinging to the air, watching an image slowly materialize in the developer tray. It was a photo of a single, skeletal tree against a winter sky, a study in solitude. My phone, left on the counter, buzzed insistently. I almost ignored it, lost in the delicate alchemy of the process. But something about the rhythm of the vibration felt urgent. I wiped my hands, stepped out into the hallway, and answered. Leo? It was Julian's voice, but it was a version I had never heard before. It was thin, frayed at the edges, stripped of all its usual warmth and confidence. It was the sound of a string stretched to its breaking point. Julian? What's wrong? Where are you? I'm at the airport, he said, his voice cracking on the last word. I just landed. Sarah ended it. Over text. A text message. After 2 years. Sarah had been the longest, the most serious. She was the one he'd talked about moving in with, the one who had, for a time, seemed to solve the puzzle of his transient life. My first instinct was a selfish, shameful flash of something that felt horribly like hope, a feeling so ugly I immediately shoved it down, disgusted with myself. It was instantly replaced by a wave of pure, unadulterated concern for him. I could hear the hollow echo of the airport terminal behind his voice, the disembodied announcements of arrivals and departures. He was surrounded by thousands of people, and he had never sounded more alone. Okay, I said, my voice steady, professional, the way I spoke to a nervous client. Okay, stay right there. I'm coming to get you. I found him sitting on a bench outside baggage claim, staring blankly at the chaotic traffic of cabs and shuttles. He looked smaller than I'd ever seen him, folded in on himself, his expensive suit rumpled and his tie loosened. He hadn't even seen me until I was standing right in front of him. When he looked up, his eyes were hollowed out, red-rimmed. He looked like a ghost. I didn't say anything. I just took his suitcase from his hand and put my other hand on his shoulder, a solid, grounding pressure. He flinched, just for a second, then seemed to lean into the touch, a silent surrender. The drive back to my apartment was silent. Julian just stared out the window, the city lights washing over his pale, drawn face. I didn't push him to talk. The silence was heavy, but it felt necessary, a space for his shock to settle. When we got to my place, he walked in and just stood in the middle of the living room, looking around as if he'd never seen it before. He was an anchor that had lost its mooring, and he was drifting in the center of my tiny world. I don't think I can go back to my apartment, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Everything in there is hers. Half of it is hers. That was when it started. That was the night of the first question. The night he asked to stay. It wasn't a proposition. It was a plea. He was a refugee seeking sanctuary, and my apartment, my quiet, unassuming space, was the only embassy he could find. I gave him a set of sweatpants and a t-shirt, pointed him to the bathroom, and pulled the spare blankets out of the hall closet. When he came out, he looked like a kid playing dress-up in his dad's clothes. He was swimming in my things. The couch is all yours, I said, trying to keep my tone light. He looked at the sofa, then back at me, his eyes filled with a raw, desperate vulnerability that stripped away all my defenses. Leo, he started, then stopped, swallowing hard. Would it be? I mean, is it weird if? I just don't want to be alone right now. Every alarm in my head was screaming. This was the line. This was the boundary I had sworn never to cross. Letting him sleep on my couch was one thing. Letting him into my bed, even platonically, was a completely different territory. It was a level of intimacy my carefully constructed friendship was not designed to withstand. But the plea in his eyes was too powerful. It bypassed all my rational thought, all my years of self-protection, and went straight for the heart. Saying no felt less like an act of self-preservation and more like an act of cruelty. My bed's not that big, I said, the words feeling clumsy and inadequate. I don't care, he whispered. I just please. And so, I led him to my bedroom. To my bed, the inner sanctum. I got in on my side, my back rigid, my muscles coiled tight. He slid in on the other side, keeping a careful, respectful distance between us. The room was dark, the only light a pale gray filtering in from the street. I could hear him breathing, a shaky, uneven sound in the quiet. We lay there for what felt like hours, two separate islands in the same small sea, the silence between us charged with his grief and my terror. Then, I felt a slight shift in the mattress. Leo, he whispered into the darkness. Yeah. My heart was hammering against my ribs. Thank you. And then, hesitantly, he rolled onto his side, facing my back. He didn't touch me, but I could feel the warmth of his body radiating across the few inches of empty space between us. It was an invisible current, a tangible heat that felt both scorching and life-giving. I lay there, rigid and sleepless, listening to his breathing as it slowly, finally, deepened into the rhythm of sleep. I felt like a watchman on a castle wall, guarding a sleeping king, terrified that one wrong move would wake him and bring the entire kingdom crashing down. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I just listened to him breathe and tried to remember how to breathe myself. That first night established the new precedent. It was a state of emergency, a temporary measure. At least, that's what I told myself. He went to his own apartment the next day, a grim, determined look on his face as he prepared to dismantle the life he had built with Sarah. He came back that evening with a duffel bag and a pizza, his eyes still shadowed with pain, but with a flicker of his old self returning. He didn't ask to stay this time. He just assumed. And I, in my role as the steadfast friend, the quiet port in his storm, just accepted it. This began the ritual. It was a silent, unspoken agreement that unfolded night after night. He would come to my apartment after work, or I would pick him up from the airport. We'd eat dinner sitting on the floor of my living room, talking about his day, my day, anything but the gaping hole in his life. He was trying so hard to be normal, to power through the heartbreak with the same relentless efficiency he applied to his job. But as the evening wore on, the facade would crumble. The exhaustion would set in, and a deep, profound sadness would settle over him like a shroud. And that was when we would migrate to the couch. It became our place. My sofa was small, a two-seater that was perfectly adequate for one person but intimate for two. At first, we'd sit at opposite ends. But his need for comfort, for simple, human contact, was a gravitational force. He'd be talking, and he'd shift closer. Or he'd be watching a movie, and his leg would come to rest against mine. I told myself it was accidental, a simple consequence of limited space. I had to. The alternative was too much to consider. Then came the first time he fell asleep on me. We were watching some mindless action movie, the kind he loved and I tolerated. He had been quiet for a while, and I glanced over to see that his eyes had closed. His head was resting against the back of the couch, but as his body relaxed into sleep, it began to list, slowly, inevitably, towards me. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tensing. I could have shifted, moved away, woken him up, but I didn't. I sat there, perfectly still, as his head finally came to rest on my shoulder. It was so light at first, a barely there pressure. But as he sank deeper into sleep, the weight of it became solid, real, an undeniable anchor. His hair, soft and smelling faintly of his ridiculously expensive shampoo, brushed against my cheek. I could feel the slow, steady rhythm of his breathing, a puff of warm air against my neck with every exhale. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs, so loud I was sure it would wake him. I sat there for over an hour, my arm going numb, my neck stiff, a prisoner of a tenderness so overwhelming it felt like a physical pain. It was the most exquisite torture I had ever known. I was a living, breathing photograph of yearning, a moment I wished I could capture and keep forever, and a moment I was terrified would shatter if I so much as breathed. This became the new ritual. The couch, the movie, the slow drift into sleep. It happened again and again. It was a dance we performed without any spoken choreography. He would settle onto the couch, already leaning slightly in my direction, and I would brace myself, my body an invitation he seemed to need on a cellular level. Sometimes he'd murmur a half-conscious apology as his head found my shoulder, a slurred, "Sorry, so tired," and I would whisper back, "It's okay. Get some rest." My life became a study in his proximity. I knew the exact weight of his head on my shoulder. I knew the sound of his breathing when he was deeply asleep versus when he was just drifting. I knew that he sometimes twitched in his sleep, his fingers brushing against my arm or my leg, sending jolts of electricity through my entire system. I was the curator of his unconscious comfort. My apartment wasn't just a sanctuary for him anymore. It was becoming a sanctuary for us, a bubble where the rules of the outside world didn't seem to apply. Inside these four walls, he could be broken, and he could be held, and he didn't have to name what it was he was seeking. And I could provide that comfort, and I didn't have to name what it was I was feeling. It was a perfect, fragile, and utterly unsustainable ecosystem. I lived in a state of constant, low-grade anxiety, a photographer perpetually waiting for the perfect, fleeting light, knowing it could vanish at any second. Every morning, he would wake up on the couch, or sometimes in my bed if he'd stumbled in there in the middle of the night, and he would be Julian again, the friend. He'd be cheerful, grateful, making jokes about how my couch was going to permanently ruin his back. The vulnerability of the night would be gone, packed away with the blankets I folded and put back in the closet. The line between us would be redrawn, crisp and clear in the morning light. And I would go along with it, playing my part, my heart a confused and battered thing. I was living between the lines, in the unspoken spaces, in the warmth he left on my couch cushions. The door was another part of the ritual, my bedroom door. After that first night, he had started sleeping on the couch, insisting it was fine. But on nights when he was particularly wrecked, after a difficult phone call with his parents, or when a memory of Sarah ambushed him, he would be restless. I would be in my room, trying to read or process photos, and I would hear him pacing in the living room. On one of those nights, I opened my door. "You can come in here if you want," I'd said, my voice quiet. "You don't have to sleep. Just stop pacing." He had looked at me with such gratitude, and had come in and just laid on top of the covers of my bed, on his side, facing away from me, and had eventually fallen asleep. After that, I started leaving my bedroom door open when he stayed over. Just a crack. It was an invitation, a silent offer of sanctuary if the living room became too lonely. Some nights, he didn't take it. He would fall asleep on the couch, and I would find him there in the morning. But other nights, hours after I had gone to bed, I would hear the soft creak of my bedroom door opening wider. I would feel the dip in the mattress as he carefully, quietly, slid into bed. He would always lie on the very edge, his back to me, a silent, respectful guest. Those nights were the worst, and they were the best. Lying in the dark, just feet away from him, the silence thick with everything we weren't saying. I wanted to roll over. I wanted to put my arm around him, to pull him close and tell him he wasn't alone. I wanted to tell him that I had been there, in that bed, wanting this for years. But I didn't. I would just lie there, my body rigid, listening to him breathe, until the sun came up. The open door was a metaphor for my heart, left ajar, with a sign that said, "Welcome," but with no guarantee that the visitor would understand the invitation or even want it. It was a constant state of offering, a constant state of quiet, agonizing hope. I began to see the change in him not just in his need for comfort, but in the way he looked at me. It was subtle, easy to dismiss if you weren't looking for it. I was always looking. I saw it in the moments when he would get back from a long trip. I'd open the door, and for a split second, before the exhaustion or the practiced cheerfulness took over, there would be a look in his eyes. A raw, unguarded relief. The look of a man who had finally come home. He started bringing me things from his trips. A bag of coffee from Seattle, a small, beautiful print from a gallery in Chicago. He'd hand them to me casually, with a dismissive, "Saw this and thought of you," but they were always things I would genuinely love. He was paying attention. He was seeing me, my tastes, my passions, with a clarity that felt new. My camera became my shield and my confessor. I started taking photos of him, not posed, but candid shots when he wasn't looking. Julian asleep on the couch, his face softened and vulnerable, the harsh lines of his waking life erased. Julian staring out my window at the rain, lost in thought, the city lights reflecting in his eyes. Julian laughing at something I said, his head thrown back, a moment of pure, unadulterated joy. I never showed them to him. I never even printed them. They lived on a password-protected hard drive, a secret gallery of my love for him. They were proof that this was real, that the tenderness I saw was not just a projection of my own desires. Looking at the photos, I could see it. I could see the shift. He was a man who was slowly, unconsciously, falling in love. Or maybe, I was a man who was slowly, unconsciously, going insane. I truly didn't know which it was. The breaking point came on a Thursday night in late autumn. It had been almost 3 months since his breakup. The raw, gaping wound of it had begun to scar over, but the sadness remained, a low-lying fog that rolled in most evenings. He had just gotten back from a brutal 2-week trip to the West Coast. He looked thinner, paler, worn down to the bone. We went through our ritual, take-out Thai food on the living room floor, him recounting the endless meetings and soulless hotel bars. But tonight, he was quieter than usual, his answers monosyllabic, his gaze distant. Later, on the couch, he didn't even pretend to watch the movie. He just curled up on his side, his back pressed against the arm of the sofa, facing me. He pulled a blanket up to his chin and watched me. He didn't say anything. He just watched me with those tired, sad eyes. The intensity of his gaze was unnerving. It felt different from all the other nights. It wasn't a look of grief or exhaustion. It was a look of searching. He was looking at me as if I held the answer to a question he didn't know how to ask. "What is it?" I finally asked, my voice soft. The sound of the movie filled the space between my question and his answer. "I don't know," he said, his voice husky with sleep or emotion. I couldn't tell. I hate it out there, Leo. I hate it. The only time I feel okay is when I'm here." My heart did a slow, painful flip in my chest. This was new. This was an admission that went beyond the immediate grief over Sarah. This was about him, about his life, about us. "This couch is magic," I joked weakly, trying to deflect the intensity of the moment, to retreat to the safety of our usual banter. He didn't smile. He just kept looking at me. "It's not the couch," he said, his voice so quiet I had to strain to hear it. And then he sat up. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace that was completely at odds with his usual restless energy. He shifted across the small space of the cushion that separated us, until his knee was brushing against mine. The air in the room grew thick, heavy. I couldn't breathe. My entire universe had shrunk to the space on this couch, to the few inches between his body and mine. He was so close I could see the faint constellation of freckles across his nose, the way his eyelashes cast shadows on his cheeks. He looked terrified. He looked more vulnerable than I had ever seen him, more than on the day Sarah left him. He raised a hand, his fingers trembling slightly, and he gently, so gently, brushed a strand of hair off my forehead. His touch was electric, a spark that lit a fire deep inside me. It was the first time he had ever touched me with such clear, unambiguous intention. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't for comfort. It was something else entirely. My carefully constructed walls, my fortress of self-protection, didn't just crack. It vaporized. It turned to dust and blew away in the face of this one, simple, terrifying gesture. He let his hand fall to my cheek, his thumb stroking my skin. His eyes searched mine, and in them I saw a maelstrom of confusion and fear and a desperate, burgeoning hope that mirrored my own. The silence stretched on, filled with the frantic beating of my own heart. The world outside, the city, the traffic, the entire universe, it all ceased to exist. There was only this room, this couch, his hand on my face, his eyes asking a question. Then he spoke, and his voice was a raw, broken whisper. "Leo." I couldn't speak. I just nodded, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement. Would it be, would it be okay, he started, his voice cracking, if I kissed you? The question. It was the question I had spent years dreaming of and years dreading in equal measure. It was the end of the world as I knew it. It was the beginning of a new one. All the possible answers flashed through my mind. The safe ones, the sensible ones, the ones that would preserve our friendship, that would send him back to his side of the couch and pretend this moment never happened. But looking at his face, at the profound, terrifying vulnerability there, I knew that safety was no longer an option. It was no longer even desirable. The loneliness of my safe, secret room was suddenly unbearable. I wanted out. I wanted this. I didn't answer with words. I couldn't. Instead, I leaned forward, closing the last inch of space between us, and I pressed my lips to his. It was not a passionate kiss. It was not hungry or demanding. It was a kiss of profound, startling tenderness. It was hesitant, soft, a question and an answer all at once. His lips were as soft as I had always imagined they would be. For a moment, we were both perfectly still, just the gentle pressure of our mouths meeting. Then I felt a shudder go through his entire body, a release of tension, as if he had been holding his breath for months. He made a small sound in the back of his throat, a sigh of relief or recognition, and his hand that was on my cheek moved to the back of my neck, his fingers tangling in my hair, holding me there. It was a kiss that felt like coming home. It was quiet, it was reverent, and it was the most honest thing that had ever passed between us. When we finally, slowly, pulled apart, we just looked at each other. His eyes were wide, shining with unshed tears. He looked stunned, as if he couldn't quite believe what had just happened, as if he couldn't believe what he had just done. Okay, he whispered, a smile finally touching his lips. It was a small, wobbly, uncertain thing, but it was the most beautiful smile I had ever seen. Yeah, I whispered back, my own voice shaky. Okay. He didn't pull away. He just rested his forehead against mine, and we stayed like that for a long time, breathing the same air, our worlds irrevocably, terrifyingly, beautifully merged. The movie played on, unheeded, casting flickering blue and orange light across our faces. In the quiet of my living room, with his forehead pressed against mine, I felt the foundations of my life settling into a new and unknown configuration. The tremor had passed. The earthquake had happened, and I was still standing, more than standing. For the first time in a very long time, I felt like I was on solid ground. The aftermath of a moment like that is never as simple as a fade to black. The morning after the kiss was shrouded in a delicate, fragile silence. We woke up in my bed, tangled together in a way that was entirely new. Sometime during the night, after that first hesitant kiss had led to a second, and then a third, we had moved from the couch to the bedroom. There had been no grand passion, just a slow, gentle exploration, a mapping of new territory with whispered words and tentative hands. It was more intimate than anything I had ever experienced. We had fallen asleep in each other's arms, and for the first time, I had slept soundly with him beside me. When I woke, the first thing I saw was his face, peaceful in sleep, his arm thrown possessively over my waist. A profound sense of rightness washed over me, a quiet joy so pure it felt sacred. I lay there, just watching him, memorizing the shape of his mouth, the way his eyelashes rested on his cheeks. This was real. This was happening. But when he started to stir, a familiar anxiety began to creep back in. The night had been a world unto itself, a dreamlike space where anything was possible. But the morning light was harsh. The morning light brought the real world, with all its rules and complexities, flooding back in. Julian woke up slowly, blinking in the morning sun filtering through my blinds. He looked at me, and for a second, I saw the same quiet joy reflected in his eyes. Then, something shifted. A cloud passed over his face. Confusion. Fear. He pulled his arm back from my waist as if he'd been burned. He sat up, running a hand through his messy hair, and he wouldn't look at me. He stammered, his voice thick with sleep. I have a call this morning. He was out of the bed before I could say anything. pulling on the clothes he'd worn the day before. The easy intimacy of the night, the warmth of his body next to mine, it all evaporated in an instant. He was putting his armor back on, the friendly, professional, detached persona he used for the outside world. He was building a wall between us, right there in my bedroom, and I was too stunned to do anything but watch. "Julian," I said, my voice quiet. I'll call you later," he said, not looking at me. He grabbed his bag from the living room, and a moment later, I heard the front door click shut behind him. He was gone. The silence he left behind was deafening. It was 1,000 times worse than the silence of my old loneliness. This was a new kind of silence, one that was filled with the ghost of a touch, the echo of a whisper. I sat in my bed, the sheets still holding the faint scent of him, and I felt a cold, sickening dread pool in my stomach. I had misinterpreted everything. The kiss, the tenderness, the whispered, "Okay," it was a mistake. A moment of grief-fueled confusion on his part, a catastrophic miscalculation on mine. The beautiful, fragile world we had built the night before had shattered with the morning light. The next few days were a special kind of hell. He didn't call. I sent him a text the next day, a casual, "Hey, hope your call went well." It was a test, a timid little white flag sent out into the terrifying silence. I watched the 3 little dots appear and disappear for what felt like an eternity before my phone went dark again. He had read it, and he hadn't replied. Each day that passed without a word from him was another layer of confirmation. I had ruined it. I had taken his vulnerability, his grief, and I had twisted it into something it wasn't. I had crossed a line that should never have been crossed, and in doing so, I had lost not only the possibility of a future I had just dared to imagine, but the friendship that had been the bedrock of my life for years. The pain of it was a physical thing. It was a hollow ache in my chest, a constant, leaden weight. My apartment, once my sanctuary, felt like a prison. Every corner held a memory of him. The couch where he had slept on my shoulder. The spot on the floor where he'd laughed at my stupid joke. The bed where we had. I couldn't even think about it. I threw myself into my work. I spent hours in the darkroom, the chemical smell a welcome assault on my senses, trying to burn his image out of my mind. But it was no use. Every photo I tried to develop felt empty, meaningless. The passion I had for my art was inextricably linked to my feelings for him, to the way I saw the world through the lens of my love for him. Without him, the world just looked flat, gray. After a week of this agonizing silence, something inside me broke. It was a quiet, cold snap. The pain curdled into a slow-burning anger. An anger at him, for being a coward. But mostly, an anger at myself, for letting this happen, for not protecting myself. And under the anger, a sliver of defiance. I wasn't going to let him ghost me. I wasn't going to let him erase what had happened between us, whether it was a mistake or not. It had happened. It was real, and it deserved more than a silent, cowardly retreat. I deserved more than that. Our friendship, at the very least, deserved a proper burial. I found him at a bar downtown, a place he sometimes went with his colleagues after work. I stood outside for a long time, watching him through the large plate glass window. He was sitting with a group of people, laughing at something someone said. He looked fine. He looked normal. He looked like the Julian from before Sarah, before the grief, before my couch, before my bed. A bitter, hot wave of hurt washed over me. Was it really that easy for him to just switch it off? To pretend none of it had ever happened? I took a deep breath, walked in, and went straight to his table. The laughter died as I approached. He looked up, and when he saw me, the color drained from his face. He looked like he'd seen a ghost. "Leo," he said, his voice barely audible. "Can we talk?" I asked, my voice colder and harder than I intended. "Outside." He hesitated for a second, glancing at his confused colleagues, then nodded and followed me out onto the street. The night air was crisp and cold. We stood under a flickering street lamp, the sounds of the city a dull roar around us. "What are you doing here?" he asked, shoving his hands in his pockets, refusing to meet my eyes. "What am I doing here?" I repeated, my voice tight with a week's worth of pain and confusion. "What the hell do you think I'm doing here, Julian? You kissed me. You stayed in my bed. And then you vanished. For a week. No call, no text, nothing. You just disappeared. And I want to know why. He flinched at the word kissed, as if it were a physical blow. He looked around, as if worried someone might overhear. Leo, keep your voice down, he hissed. No, I said, my voice rising despite myself. I'm not going to keep my voice down. I have spent years being quiet about this, about you. I have lived in the silences and the spaces between words, and I am done. You came to me. You were the one who couldn't be alone. You were the one who fell asleep on my shoulder. You were the one who asked to kiss me. And now you're acting like I'm some dirty secret, like it was all some horrible mistake that needs to be forgotten. Was it? Just tell me. Was it a mistake? He finally looked at me, and his face was a wreck of conflicting emotions. Agony, fear, shame. I don't know, he whispered, and the words were so full of genuine despair that it took all the air out of my anger. You don't know? I asked, my voice softening, breaking. How can you not know? Because I've never. This has never, he trailed off, gesturing helplessly with his hands. All my life, it's been one way. Girls. Sarah. It was a map I understood. And then, with you, it's like I'm in a foreign country without a map, without a compass, and I don't know the language. It felt right. That night, with you, it was the first time I felt truly calm, truly safe, in months. In years, maybe. And it felt more right than anything has in a very long time. And that scares the hell out of me, Leo. It scares me because I don't know what it means. He looked down at the sidewalk, his shoulders slumped in defeat. I'm so sorry, he whispered. I ran because I'm a coward. I saw how easy it was to be with you, how good it felt, and I panicked. I thought if I just ignored it, it would go away. I could just put it back in the box and pretend it never happened, and we could go back to being friends. Is that what you want? I asked, my heart aching for him, for both of us. To go back. He looked up, and his eyes were shining with tears. He shook his head slowly. No, he said, his voice thick. God, no. But I don't know how to go forward. I looked at him, at this brilliant, beautiful, and utterly terrified man, and all my anger dissolved, replaced by a wave of overwhelming, painful tenderness. He wasn't a villain. He was just lost. As lost as he was the night he first showed up at my door. He had spent his whole life walking a straight, clearly marked path, and he had just realized he was standing at a crossroads he never even knew existed. I stepped closer to him, into his personal space, and this time, he didn't flinch. I reached out and took his hand. His fingers were ice cold. He laced his fingers with mine, his grip tight, desperate. So we learn, I said softly. Together. You don't need a map, Julian. You just need to not run away. He let out a shaky breath, a sound that was half sob, half laugh. He squeezed my hand. Okay, he whispered, echoing the word from that night on the couch. Okay. We stood there for a long time, under the flickering streetlight, just holding hands. The world around us kept moving, cars rushing past, people laughing as they left the bar, but we were in our own bubble of stillness. It wasn't a solution. It wasn't a neat and tidy ending. But it was a start. It was a promise. The promise not to run. The promise to be brave enough to be lost, together. The silence between us was no longer agonizing. It was filled with a fragile, terrifying, and beautiful hope. We had found each other in the dark, and now, maybe, we could learn how to walk into the light. The conversation outside the bar was not a magic cure. It was more like setting a broken bone. The process was painful and necessary, and it was only the first step in a long, slow period of healing. We walked away from the bar that night, still holding hands, and went back to my apartment. The air was thick with a new kind of tension, not the anxiety of the unknown, but the awkwardness of the newly defined. We were no longer just friends, but we didn't yet have the language or the rhythm for what we were becoming. That night, when we went to bed, the hesitation was back, but for a different reason. It wasn't about whether we would touch, but how. All our previous intimacy had been born of a kind of plausible deniability. He was grieving. He needed comfort. Now, there was no pretext. There was only intention. I felt him hesitate at the edge of the bed, and I knew he was spiraling, lost in his fear of the unknown. So I made the choice for him. I reached out, took his hand, and pulled him down next to me. I wrapped my arms around him, pulling him close until his back was flush against my chest, and I just held him. "Just sleep," I whispered into his hair. "That's all. Just sleep." I felt the tension drain out of him in a long, shuddering sigh. He relaxed into my hold, his body molding against mine, and for the second time, he fell asleep in my arms. But this time was different. This wasn't me guarding a sleeping king. This was two people, scared and uncertain, choosing to find refuge in each other. There was no secret room inside me anymore. The door had been kicked off its hinges, and the light was pouring in. It was blinding and terrifying, but it was also warm. The days and weeks that followed were a delicate dance of learning each other in this new context. There were moments of beautiful, breathtaking intimacy. Waking up in the morning and his first move being to find my hand. The first time he kissed me good morning, a soft, sleepy press of lips that felt more real than any passionate movie kiss. The first time he said, "I'm heading home," and I knew he meant my apartment, not his. He slowly moved his life into mine, not with boxes and a moving truck, but piece by piece. A toothbrush appeared in my bathroom holder. A few of his shirts took up residence in my closet. His favorite coffee mug became a permanent fixture on my drying rack. My sanctuary for one was slowly, organically, becoming a home for two. But there were also moments of fear and retreat. Sometimes, I would catch him looking at me with that old, familiar panic in his eyes. A friend would call and ask about Sarah, and he would freeze, unsure what to say. He was recalibrating his entire identity, the entire narrative of his life, and it was not an easy or linear process. There were days when he would be distant, lost in his own head, and my old insecurities would flare up, whispering that this was all temporary, that he would eventually retreat back to the safety of the life he had known. In those moments, I had to learn to be patient. I had to learn to trust what we were building, even when it felt fragile. I had to trust the man who fell asleep in my arms every night, not the ghost of the man he thought he was supposed to be. My photography became a way for me to process it. I finally started printing the photos I had taken of him. I hung one in our bedroom, a simple, quiet shot of his hand resting on my pillow. It wasn't a picture of his face, but it was a picture of his presence, of his choice to be here. When he saw it, he didn't say anything. He just came up behind me, wrapped his arms around my waist, and rested his chin on my shoulder, and we looked at it together. It was a silent acknowledgement, an acceptance. We learned to talk, really talk, not just about our days, but about our fears. One night, lying in the dark, he turned to me and said, "I think I was lonely for years and I just didn't know it. I was always moving, always surrounded by people, but I was so lonely. I thought finding the right girl would fix it. But Sarah, I loved her, I did, but I was still lonely. It wasn't until I was here, with you, that the feeling finally went away." His confession was a key, unlocking the last guarded chamber of my own heart. I was lonely, too. I admitted, my voice thick. Even with you. Especially with you. Because I had you, but I didn't. Not in the way I wanted. He rolled over to face me, his eyes searching mine in the dim light. "How long?" he asked softly. "A long time," I whispered. "Since a library in college, if I'm being honest." A single tear traced a path down his temple and into his hair. "God, Leo," he breathed. "All that time. You were so patient." "I didn't have a choice," I said. "It was either be your friend or have nothing." "I'm so sorry I made you choose," he said, his voice raw. He leaned in and kissed me, a kiss that was full of regret and gratitude and a deep, profound love that finally had a name. It was in these conversations, in these shared vulnerabilities, that we built our new foundation. Not on the shifting sands of need and grief, but on the solid rock of honesty and mutual recognition. Slowly, the world outside our bubble began to filter in, and we had to decide how to face it. The first time he introduced me to one of his work colleagues, he hesitated for a fraction of a second, and then said, "This is Leo, my partner." The word hung in the air, solid and real and terrifying and wonderful. He said it with a quiet confidence that made my heart swell. He was done running. He was choosing his map. He was choosing me. And I chose him. I learned to let go of the quiet observer I had been for so long and to step into the frame. I learned that love wasn't something to be captured from a distance, but something to be lived in, to be messy and complicated and beautiful in. My art changed. I started taking portraits of people, of couples. I found I had a knack for capturing the quiet, unspoken connection between them, the invisible threads that bound them together. I knew what to look for because I was finally living it. There are moments in your life that are destinations, and there are moments that are doorways. That first night Julian asked to stay, I thought it was a destination, a final, painful point on the map of my unrequited love. But I was wrong. It wasn't an ending. It was a threshold. It was a doorway into a room I never knew existed, a room filled with a life I had never been brave enough to imagine for myself. We had to stumble through the dark. We had to get lost. We had to tear down the walls we had built around our own hearts. But in the end, we found each other. He didn't just become the reason I started to heal from my loneliness. He became my home. And in the quiet, beautiful, honest space we learned to build together, we found that we had both, finally, stopped running. We had found our way.